Things never go my way. She's late. It's raining. Probably crashed into something. It's like in a ditch now somewhere, dead. I just screwed up this presentation. Maybe I'm not good at this. Probably just give up. These are, as you can probably tell, negative thoughts. They're known as cognitive distortions. They're thought patterns that can cause people to see reality in, kind of messed up and often negative ways. Most people experience cognitive distortions from time to time, but they become problematic when they dominate our thinking, because then they can increase our anxiety, they can deepen our depression, create problems within our relationships, and basically make our lives more difficult. And apparently they exist because they help us cope with immediate stress. And while it might help us cope with immediate stress, in the long term, it might not be beneficial. So it's important to identify them. And they've been researched extensively by the creator of cognitive behavioral therapy, which is one of the most empirically supported types of therapy out there. The most researched and supported. Developed by Aaron Beck. And today we're going to go over some of the most common distortions. Number one, in no specific order, is overgeneralization. It's when somebody draws a conclusion about one thing and then incorrectly applies that same assumption to every other thing. For example, let's say you get a low test score in a science class on a test, right? Now, if you overgeneralize, then you assume that you'll never succeed in science. You're bad at every single science area or subject because of that one test. Now, why is this inaccurate and problematic? Because a score in earth science, a low test score in earth science does not predict you doing poorly in chemistry or biology or any other science field, right? One test score cannot be generalized to the entire field of science. It's not logical. Or if one relationship didn't work out, then you overgeneralize by assuming that you're just not good at relationships. Maybe no relationship will work out. And if you haven't guessed, it can easily damage your self-esteem and worldview. Number two is personalization, when you take things personally when they're not related to you or caused by you in any way whatsoever. You may blame yourself for situations or things that were out of your control or weren't your fault. For example, you show up at a restaurant and you sit down and then you notice your spot at the table is missing a fork. So now you start to think, wow, this was a targeted offense. Somebody was out to get you and they deliberately didn't put the fork in that seat because you were going to sit there. It's because of you that the fork is missing. Now, obviously you sat in a random spot. It wasn't planned at all and is very, very, very unlikely that the waiter or anybody else knew you were going to sit in that spot and specifically, deliberately, intentionally didn't put the fork there. Very unlikely that you were being targeted specifically. So it may cause you to compare yourself with other people, and it's associated with heightened anxiety and depression. Number three is catastrophizing. You assume the worst possible outcome in a situation. You find yourself thinking, what if this happens? And you think this quite often. This dominates your thinking. This is their curfew. You assume, okay, they've been abducted, they're doing drugs, or they've been killed. Catastrophizing makes ordinary worries multiply. If you expected a check or a deposit in your bank account and it doesn't come when you expect it, then you start to think, okay, maybe it's never going to come, or maybe it's not going to come on time. And if it doesn't come on time, I won't be able to pay for rent on time. If I don't pay for rent, then I'm going to get evicted. Because the check didn't arrive on time, I'm going to be evicted, which might not be the case. You might think that this is just hysterical overreacting, but people who experience catastrophizing or people who catastrophize may have experienced adverse events like chronic pain or childhood trauma. So now they fear the worst. People who catastrophize might see everything as pointless. Number four is discounting the positive. When something good happens, you play it down and you try to minimize it. Let's say you get a promotion or a raise at work. Now, you acknowledge it, but you refuse to take credit at all. Instead, you say that it's dumb luck or even a mistake. You refuse to acknowledge that it might be your efforts, your intelligence at all. You assume it can't be because of you. Let's say you get evaluated at work. You get a lot of positive evaluation, but you focus instead on the two or few negative evaluations. This can hurt a person's sense of personal pride and their self-esteem, and anxiety is associated with discounting the positive. Number five is emotional reasoning. You believe your emotions are the truth, that your emotions are an accurate measure of reality. You use your gut feelings over concrete evidence to judge yourself and the world. For example, I feel like a bad mom, so I must really be an awful mom, instead of considering evidence based on what you've actually done, incidences in which you've actually might have been a good mom. It can be harmful because it can lead to bad or irrational decision making and judgments. Eating disorders and other behavior changes might come from emotional reasoning. Number 6 is labeling. You generalize all of their attributes and their characteristics into a label or two. And you might focus on one past behavior or one event. So if your coworker shows up to work late, then that means they're lazy. If someone gets a question wrong in class, then you label them stupid. Labeling can damage your sense of self-worth and your perception of others. It can lead you to underestimate them. Number 7 is black and white thinking. You think in extremes. Either things or people are great or they're terrible. Either you're destined for success or you're destined for failure. You don't allow room for balanced perspectives or outcomes. Because in reality, people and situations are more complicated. The reality is that they're somewhere in the middle. Number 8 is jumping to conclusions. You base your decisions not on what other people think or say or do, but on what you think. So you're not basing your judgments on your emotions, like with emotional reasoning, but you're basing your judgments purely and entirely on what you think, and not examining evidence outside of yourself properly. You think something, but you don't confirm what the other person thinks or feels. One example is mind reading. We try to fill the gaps in our knowledge by assuming we know what the other person is thinking. And I'm sure we've all done this at some point, in which we try to assume what the other person is thinking, and I'm sure it's also happened to us that we find out that we're wrong. I remember at an orientation event, this girl told me that I came off as intimidating, and I could never think of myself as intimidating. So what we think of ourselves and what we think about others might not always be true. We believe we know the other person's thoughts and their reaction, but of course we don't. Maybe we were right once in the past, and now we think that we're always right. Another example is fortune telling. Cognitive distortion in which we jump to conclusions. We assume we know what the outcome is regardless of what our actions will be, like we'll be famous without any hard work, or we'll always be a failure no matter what we do, so it's just pointless trying. And of course, nobody knows the future. Number 9 are should statements. We assume that people or things should have been a certain way. They ought have been a certain way. I don't think anybody says that anymore. Anyways, it's rarely useful or beneficial to tell yourself, this should have happened, or they should have said this. It ends up giving you a negative view of the outcome or the person. And these often come from internalized family or cultural expectations. And these expectations might not necessarily be realistic or applicable to your situation. Number 9 is mental filtering. You ignore all the positives and you focus purely on the negatives. You may be healthy, be able to pay for rent. You might have access to education, to clean water, institutions like roads, bridges, hospitals, but your life is awful because you're 21 years old and you can't get a girlfriend. It's inaccurate and it's not beneficial to focus and zero in on that one aspect of your life that might not be going the way you want it to go, and then let it define everything else. So these are cognitive distortions, and once again, everybody has them, but they can become problematic if they dominate our thinking. And if that ends up happening, they can cause problems and lower our quality of life. And it's for us to identify and challenge these cognitive distortions. And of course, if it's too much, if it's overwhelming, then I'd highly recommend you see a trained clinician, a licensed professional. And maybe we'll see a video in the future about challenging these distortions and recognizing them. So that's all for today. I'll see you guys in the next one.